Welcome to the National Book Foundation's Literature for Justice event. I'm Candace Jones, President and CEO of the Public Welfare Foundation. It's an honor to present today's event alongside the National Book Foundation and Free Minds Book Club. Public Welfare Foundation has supported efforts to catalyze justice and opportunity for more than 70 years. Today, our efforts focus on catalyzing a transformative approach to justice that is community-led, restorative, and racially just. I'm speaking to you from our offices at the True Reformer Building in Washington, D.C. Dedicated in 1903, the True Reformer Building was the first building in the United States to be designed, financed, built, and owned by the African American community after Reconstruction. If these walls could talk, they'd share stories from the DC chapter of the National Negro Business League meetings, or the plans of the 1st Separate Battalion, an African American branch of the DC National Guard. They'd tell you about some of the early performances of Duke Ellington. This building was designed for reform and transformation. It serves as both a symbol of where we've been and inspiration for where we're headed. That's why, when we initially planned this event, we'd hoped we'd be able to welcome you here at the True Reformer Building. We are so grateful that you could join us virtually, and while we're not together physically, we know that we're together in the struggle for transformative change. We're joined today by an incredible group of authors, all of whom are shifting the narrative around justice through their craft. I'm going to turn it over now to an incredible leader in her own right, National Book Foundation Executive Director, Lisa Lucas, and she'll share more about the Literature for Justice program and walk us through the format of today's event. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Candace, and hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Lucas, and I'm the outgoing Executive Director of the National Book Foundation. We're so grateful to be here with you in partnership with Public Welfare Foundation and Free Minds Book Club and Writing Workshop. Although we wish, like always, that we were gathered together at the True Reformer Building in Washington, D.C. as we planned last spring, we're so thrilled to be able to make this event more accessible to even more folks around the globe. So thank you all for joining us. The National Book Foundation's mission is to celebrate the best literature in America, to expand its audience, and to ensure that books have a prominent place in American culture. Since March, we've pivoted our education and public programs online, and today we're celebrating the 3rd and final year of Literature for Justice, which curates an annual reading list on the complex issues of mass incarceration, with huge thanks to the Art for Justice Fund. We're so proud of the way that this program and the 17 books we've highlighted over the course of 3 years contribute to, instruct, and deepen the national conversation happening around America's carceral system. This program means a lot to me. For over 70 years, the National Book Foundation has helped to identify great books, but Literature for Justice is our first, and I hope are not our last, program that focuses this power of amplification on specific issues facing our country. Through this project, we've been able to work alongside committees of authors, advocates, and experts in the field who've pushed us to expand our model of book distribution, including public housing authorities through book-rich environments, to libraries and colleges through NBF Presents, to reach those who are currently incarcerated. We do this through partnerships with Reginald Dwayne Betts' Million Book Project and nonprofits like Free Minds, donating Literature for Justice books to feature in this month's DC jail book clubs, in addition to sending books to readers in federal prisons across the country. Needless to say, this has been a very tough year for so many. And for the National Book Foundation to continue doing this work of supporting readers everywhere, we actually need your help. So if you're able to, you can support our year-round efforts at nationalbook.org/donate. With over 2 million people incarcerated in the United States alone, we, fueled by the Art for Justice Fund, aim to turn art into action. Our hope is that everyone reads these books and talks about these books. We believe that books can change hearts and minds, and the 7 books honored today and across the year were selected by leaders thinking and working towards a brighter, more equitable future. Here they are. Susan Burton, founder of A New Way of Life and author of Becoming Mrs. Burton, a 2019-2020 Literature for Justice selected title. Natalie Diaz, Art for Justice grantee and author of Post-Colonial Love Poem, a finalist for the 2020 National Book Award for Poetry. Eddie S. Glaude Jr., Chair of African American Studies at Princeton University and author of Democracy in Black and Begin Again. Mariame Kaba, who is sadly unable to join us today, is a fearsome organizer, educator, and founder of Project NAA. And last but not least, Piper Kerman, activist and author of Orange is the New Black. For today's program, our committee will kick us off, providing the context for this year's Literature for Justice reading list. After a brief stage transition, we'll bring up the authors of the 2021 reading list: Dionne Brand, author of Ossuaries; Nicole R. Fleetwood, author of Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration; Ruth Wilson Gilmore, author of Golden Gulag, Prisons, Surplus, Crisis, and Opposition in Globalizing California; Sarah Haley, author of No Mercy Here, Gender, Punishment, and the Making of Jim Crow Modernity; Kelly Lytle Hernández, author of City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles, 1771 to 1965. And last but not least, Albert Woodfox, author of Solitary, for a question and answer session, so please get your questions ready for the live chat. Thank you to these authors and to these committee members who have joined us and inspire us to think deeply, not only about what the current carceral system is, but where and what our path forward is. Notably, we have one featured author, Assata Shakur, who is unable to join us today. But with thanks to Free Minds book clubbers, we'll have some thoughts and questions for the program's second half, inspired by her groundbreaking work, Assata, an autobiography. As she wrote, "It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other, and we have nothing to lose but our chains." And now it is my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's moderator, Naomi Murakawa, an associate professor of African American Studies at Princeton and author of The First Civil Right: How Liberals Built Prison America. Thank you again for caring about these issues and for being here today.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murakawa. Thank you for tuning in, and I'm so happy to be here with the Literature for Justice committee members. I want to start by thanking the four of you and Mariame Kaba, who couldn't be here today, for your work and for your wisdom in curating this list of 7 phenomenal books. I imagine this was a monumental undertaking, and we want to hear a little bit about how the Literature for Justice Committee came to choose these particular books. Piper Kerman, I wanted to start with you. I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about how the committee was thinking in selecting Nicole Fleetwood's Marking Time and Albert Woodfox's Solitary. Unmute.
Classic. Thanks, Naomi. It's wonderful to see all my fellow committee members again, against all odds, with such a difficult and challenging subject. It was really fun to work with this committee, and we read a rich array of different kinds of work on such a complex and multifaceted subject. And we were able to bring, books that we were passionate about and hear from other committee members about books that they're incredibly passionate about. And that was completely inspiring to me. I want to talk about Nicole Fleetwood's wonderful book, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration. I was excited about this book before I ever laid eyes on it, because I know some of the artists whose work is included in this book. But when I actually received the book, I was completely blown away. It's a very deeply personal book from a professor who has a rigorous and unique perspective on her discipline, but also is incredibly generous in the text in terms of sharing the impact of mass incarceration on her personally, on her family, and on her community more broadly. So not only does the book do a phenomenal job of pinpointing some of the really unique facets of visual art in a carceral setting and in a correctional setting, but also it puts it into these incredibly human terms. I know as a formerly incarcerated person how important creative expression is when people are incarcerated, and specifically how important visual creativity is in a setting which is incredibly drab, intentionally inhumane, intentionally sort of deadening. Mass incarceration, obviously echoes mass production and industrialization. And when you are incarcerated, you really do feel reduced to an object. And so all creative responses in that setting are acts of autonomy, acts of defiance against a system that oppresses you. And visual art is something that all kinds of folks can bring to bear in their work, in their lives, regardless of, educational attainment, et cetera. I have to point out that behind me on the wall is a portrait of Prince that was made by an incarcerated man in the prison where I taught for more than 4 years. And it's an incredibly important keepsake for me. I have portraits of my own students. That visual production serves to declare humanity and declare visibility in a setting and a system which is intended to erase people and to disappear them. And all of that comes through when you read Nicole's beautiful book. And also the book is just stunning and rich. I don't come out of a visual arts background myself, but I think it's an incredibly accessible work, despite its intellectual and academic rigor, to people who are not steeped in art history or, the formal academic art language. I think it's a very accessible book in that regard as well. And so I was just over the moon when I received it, and very, very excited to bring it to the committee, and very excited by its reception, from my fellow committee members. That's and also I think when we look at all of the incredible books that have been included in the 3 years of Art for Justice, I also think it stands out as a very unique book. I think it's a unique book, compared to any other volume that I've seen on mass incarceration, including volumes that deal with visual arts, which tend to often be photography or painting. So I really encourage folks to pick it up and take a look.
And you were also going to discuss Solitary.
Mm-hmm. Right. So Albert Woodfox's book, his incredible memoir, Solitary, relates more than 40 years of endurance of the condition of total isolation that we call solitary confinement. And there are all kinds of other words that the carceral system likes to use for solitary confinement. I'll point out that in this country, we have no harsher penalty other than a penalty of death, other than solitary confinement, the condition in which someone spends 23 hours a day isolated in a cell, cut off from all human contact. As a person who has written about her own personal experiences with incarceration, I sort of stand in awe of Albert Woodfox's story. And I stand in awe of the story that's told in this book. It's beautifully told. I can say that for formerly incarcerated writers or currently incarcerated writers who are trying to write about that experience of incarceration, there are all kinds of barriers, like trying to bring to life, the way that time crawls by, whether you're in solitary confinement or whether you're simply enduring a sentence. And this book does an incredible job of really bringing all of the, myriad conflicts that Alfred Woodfox endured to life. And I think that solitary confinement merits great attention because it is widely used in American prisons and jails. For example, when I think about the men that I taught in an Ohio State prison, almost all of them had experienced solitary confinement at some point during their sentence. These were not unusual guys. These were in some ways very ordinary prisoners. That's how widespread it is. I also encourage people to think about solitary confinement, to read, Woodfox's book, because it's important to understand that solitary confinement is just the jail within the jail, right? And so if we think solitary confinement is inhumane and wrong, and it is widely acknowledged to be a form of torture, then we have to broaden the lens and question whether the isolation, the exile, the banishment of prison itself is something that has any value to us as a society. And so that's yet another of the reasons. And I think that Solitary, Woodfox's book, brings us to that question so beautifully through that personal lens. And as a memoirist, I'm extremely grateful to him for being willing to share his story with the world.
Susan Burton, I was hoping you could discuss Assata Shakur's autobiography and Sarah Haley's No Mercy Here.
Yes. First, I'd like to thank Literature for Justice for this program and for allowing me to be a part of the selection of the books this year. I almost get a chill when I think of Assata Shakur's book and reading it, the intensity in which it grabbed and held me. Her book is timeless, and it just captures the pain and her struggle. And, I relate to it as a Black woman in America, what I went through, similar to what women go through, especially incarcerated women. And she wrote this 50 years ago. Mm. And so it has this timeless quality to it. But it also captures the leadership of Black women. Mm-hmm. And all that will be done to try to destroy that leadership. I mean, her book was just grabbing and definitely a page turner. When I was told the women in the DC jail got the opportunity to receive the books, there was this spark of joy that that rose up in me because most importantly, I believe what Assata's book teaches us is to never give up, to continue to fight, to not let go, lay down, and roll over, to continue to stand by whatever means or any means necessary. So again, I was thrilled to be able to read that book again and to be here today to comment on it. It just teaches us so much. I was speaking to Natalie before we came on, and I said, I just want to go to Cuba to just hug Assata, of course, when COVID-19 passes, but to just meet her. If I just get on a plane, spend an hour in Cuba, meeting and talking to Assata, I would be just like fulfilled for that. It's just a beautiful read and a gripping read and a challenging read. So yeah, Assata. I encourage everyone to read that timeless book. And No Mercy Here sort of rounds out Assata's book for me just the title, No Mercy Here, again, captures me in a way that says that is the reality of so many. I'm sure the women in the DC jail right now is thinking no mercy here is what they go through. Piper just talked about solitary confinement and the way humanity is ripped, dignity and your humanity is ripped ripped from you through periods of incarceration. So No Mercy Here was a page turner, and I loved reading it, and it captured so much of the reality of the experience that is displayed in the title. I want to say all of the books that were selected this year for the 2021 reading were excellent books. There are so many books out there, and it was difficult for us to actually, there's usually 5 books. We kind of pushed the margins this time and went to 7 books. But there are so many out there, but these were the best of the best. So again, I want to thank the Literature for Justice program. I want to thank all of my committee members for being a part of the read and the selection. The country is shutting down again. And so we have time to sort of read our books and take on this reading list. It's rich, it's beautiful. And so I invite our nation to select these books as reading materials through this winter. Thanks.
Great. Natalie Diaz, can you say a few words about Dionne Brand's Ossuaries?
Yeah, gracias for the work everybody's done to put this together in Literature for Justice. Also, it's really lucky for me to be among Eddie, Piper, Susan, and Mariame, who can't be here with us, and all of the writers and books whose work has been incredibly important to my family. One of the ways I engage is that I have a brother and a sister who have been in prison and spent time incarcerated. And so these works have been very important on a very personal level into, my family. It's lucky to think in this kind of constellation. That's one of the things we had all talked about these books as being a kind of constellation, because Eddie was talking earlier too about this moment right now of, Obama having come out and called the defund the police a slogan, and to criticize that language. And for me, these books and these conversations disallow him to say that defund the police or these other ways that we were talking about dismantling the system. These books are showing, one, why we need that, but also the language and the actions that are leading the way to do that. Coming after Susan and thinking about Assata and thinking about No Mercy Here feels like a perfect place to enter in Dionne Brand's Ossuaries. One, because we have within the book a character named Yasmin who is a fugitive. And of course, we know that's what the carceral system creates, is fugitivity. You never are allowed to, they say you've completed your time, but you are never allowed to complete that time. You are constantly on the run from that punitive system and the way you've been judged by it. And thinking just very largely about many of our conditions in the United States, we're always fugitive to what has been done to us by the country. And then we become fugitive to what we have done to try to survive within that system and within those actions. And so Ossuaries is very much about fugitivity. In some ways, I think it's very tied also to No Mercy Here, because with this character, Yasmin, we're very much, we are allowed to hold anger and tenderness and sensuality together at the same time. And that's one of the things that the carceral system tries to take away. It tries to take away your sensualities. That idea of queerness becomes so important because within that carceral system, within imprisonment, detention, confinement, queerness becomes a necessary intimacy, even when it's not a sexual queerness. But the idea that touch and sensuality can be had and created in many different ways, many different languages, and the reminder that we have a sensual body that deserves tendernesses. It deserves certain kinds of touches, certain kinds of stories and interactions. And so, thinking about what Dion created of this character and how she moves across borders, always fugitive, but still always possible, even within moments that feel angry or violent, that the demand for tenderness and desire is still there. And that feels essential to me. And it's interesting, in some ways, I'm a poet, so it's not necessarily interesting to me, but I think sometimes from an outside perspective, to consider a poetry book within some of these larger textual contexts might seem, at odds. However, this book is so much bigger than a stanza or a line, or even what we've learned poetry can be in contemporary American poetry. And so for me, that was one of the very important things that I just kind of wanted to open up with Ossuaries right now in constellation with some of these other things we've talked about.
Great. And Eddie Glaude, you were going to talk a little bit about Kelly Lytle Hernández's City of Inmates and Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag.
Yeah. First, let me thank you, Naomi, for moderating, and I want to thank Literature for Justice, and especially for the experience with my wonderful colleagues on the committee. I learned so much reading the material, but actually listening to the way in which they discussed the material. And I think coming out of Natalie's description of Ossuaries, it's important for us to kind of emphasize the different forms, the different genres that make up the list, moving from memoir to history to poetry. In some ways, it's an echo of what Du Bois tries to do and announce in Souls of Black Folk, that not one form can account for the complexity of this experience. And so I had the deep pleasure to commend City of Inmates, this extraordinary book that pans out, that allows us to see that this city that locks up more people than any city in the world sits upon, right, cascading catastrophes, that it's predicated upon, right, a history of violence, right, of violence against indigenous peoples, violence against Mexican and Chinese immigrants, violence against poor white people, violence against Black people, right? And the first line of the book announces its intent, that mass incarceration is mass elimination. And so part of what City of Inmates does for us, right, it insists that we understand the historical backdrop to the evil that is mass incarceration, right, to the devastation that it wrought, and to understand that it's not just simply located to one, reducible to one population, that it is part of this settler colonial space that has done so much damage over the course of its long history. And then, of course, City of Inmates leads us into Golden Gulag. And let me just say, too, that the book is beautifully written, with the touch of history, with the touch of an artist as we move throughout these archives. Golden Gulag, classic book. And it's a text that we have to read in this moment when folks are in the streets clamoring for a fundamental change in the way in which we think about policing in this country, the way in which we think about safety and security, trying to dismantle and disrupt this frame of law and order. What does Ruth Gilmore tell us? Right? She gives us the history of the expansion of this carceral system within California. Here we are in this state, right, which in some ways foreshadows what the nation will do. It becomes this space that perfects this evil. And she tells this story in light of the defeat of radical movements, in light of the weakening of labor movements, in light of the shift of late capitalism and the way in which profit making is driven in terms of locking up Black and brown bodies and poor bodies and the like. It is a story that gives us resources to talk about abolition, not as some fairy tale, but as a concrete practice and aspiration. So when I read the list over its entirety, it equips us to imagine a new world. It equips us with the resources to fight for that new world. And just as Ossuaries insists, it equips us to imagine it by way of the experiences that have been defined by the horrors of this evil in some ways. So that's Hernández and Wilson.
Wonderful. So thank you to everyone on the Literature for Justice committee, including Mariame Kaba. Thank you for your insights and for really sharing how these books touch you in deeply personal and tender ways. I also want to thank you for being unruly and bucking the rule that you're only supposed to pick 5 books, because these are 7 extraordinary books and they all deserve to be on this list. And I thank you for that. Thank you for your work. Now we're going to have a very brief transition. Please don't go anywhere. We're going to bring our authors on stage and we'll be right back. Thank you for staying with us, and I want to welcome to the stage Dionne Brand, Nicole Fleetwood, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Sarah Haley, Kelly Lytle Hernández, and Albert Woodfox. Just looking at the six of you together and thinking of Assata Shakur, the seventh author who couldn't be here, fills me with so much respect and admiration and gratitude for the brilliant, beautiful Black radical tradition. I feel I see it when I look at all of you together, radiating out in all of its feminist, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial spirit. Thank you so much for your work. The 7 books being recognized today are collected under the organizing theme of mass incarceration. And the phrase usually refers to the 4-decade prison building boom that has given the United States the highest incarceration rate in the world. But reading these 7 works on their own and together tells us that we have to push out the boundaries of what it is we're fighting when we're fighting against mass incarceration, and that freedom is going to require so much more than tearing down the buildings that we call prisons. And on that note, I wanted to start by asking both Kelly and Dion about colonialism. I want to ask how you see borders as foundational technology of criminalization. Kelly, I was hoping you could start by telling us a little bit more about the opening sentence of City of Inmates. Mass incarceration is mass elimination.
Sure. Thank you, Naomi. And it's wonderful to be here with everyone. I'm looking forward to this really phenomenal conversation, like you said, emerging out of the Black radical tradition. So for me, when I began writing this book, I have been so profoundly and deeply influenced by Assata Shakur and the Black radical tradition. I brought sort of a very robust critique of racial capitalism to the story. But when I dug into the archives, I was also finding these other bits that I couldn't quite fit in. I was finding an origin story of criminalization in Los Angeles in particular around Native and Indigenous populations, an attempt to clear them from the land to make possibility for the formation of a new white settler community. And it was that origin story that forced me to look a little bit wider and to consider the extraordinary work of radical Indigenous scholars on settler colonialism and how that is at play as well in our nation's jails, prisons, and detention centers. And so it's through radical Indigenous studies and settler colonial theory that I came to this notion that mass incarceration is mass elimination, a variety of tactics across community and across time, structured to remove, to banish, to disappear, and in other ways, eliminate non-white communities from the white settler state. So that's where that came from. That's what led me to this deeply unsettling conclusion. And that also is part of this radical tradition and abolitionist tradition that this is not a reformable regime. That is something we must dig up from the root and remake our community.
Dionne Brand, I see your poetry as essential to this conversation. In Ossuaries, we learn of Yasmin, who's forced underground, and she moves across Cuba and the United States and yet unnamed galaxies. And in all this seeming freedom of movement, there is only confinement, enclosure. Everywhere she goes, there are the border patrols because they see land that they can take at their value. Can you just expand a bit for us?
Thank you very much. I am humbled by being in the presence of these wonderful minds, and I'm happy that this poem landed with you all. I'm speaking to you from above the 49th parallel right now, and the speaker of the poem, in a sense, there are 2 speakers, and one is Yasmin, who is that radical who has put her life on the line for the freedom of Black people. And then there is another speaker who is the speaker of the future, the speaker in a future time, looking back to ours. And she calls this time our wingless days, when even our dreams are full of prisons, when every waking is incarcerated. But she also speaks to the brilliant future waiting somewhere for us. The imaginary, in a sense, of the carceral and of violence against Black and Indigenous bodies has held sway, I think, and elaborated itself in the Americas since the time of transatlantic slavery and chattel slavery. The future voice looks back at this carcerality as a marker of this time and of the past 600 years. The poem is a letter from one hemisphere to another, from one time to another. In it, the present is eroding, hopefully, its collected bones and its disintegrating gigabytes of violent news into that brilliant future, the future of the present. And I think when I sit here with these thinkers, I think we are thinking our way out of this. We are thinking our way into that future. The speaker hopes that the story that we are living now and the story that we have lived will be forgotten in that future. But she sends this letter nevertheless. And so the poem rocks between these two speakers in the present time and in our future time. Even as a poem is a record of time, it is also a record of possible time. And so my grandmother used to say that time is longer than rope. And I think that is possibly the thread that we all hang on, the notion that we all work with, that time is longer, there will be relief in time and freedom in time, and we work toward that freedom. And so the speakers in the poem work toward that freedom and toward the decay of the present structure that we live under.
Wonderful. Sarah Haley and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, I wanted to turn to you. Your books compel us to rethink our habits of seeing punishment as an extreme form of unfreedom that sits over there, as if convict leasing in prisons are somehow dangling, about to fall off the cliff on the edge of democracy, or as if somehow they're suspended from economic modernization. And instead, you're both explaining how the unfreedoms of a carceral system are in fact the cornerstones of modernity and state-making under racial capitalism. Sarah, I was hoping that you could start and just, can you tell us how Jim Crow modernity was grounded in the unfreedom of gendered racial terror in the carceral system?
Sure. I'm just so moved and honored to be in this company of writers and thinkers that I so admire. And thinking about your question, I'm not sure I can think of anyone who's taught me more about that question than Assata Shakur. Reading the first pages of her autobiography changed me fundamentally and forever in thinking about the centrality of gendered racial terror in how we think about political realities, political presence. And so for me, when I think of Jim Crow modernity, or when I think of Ruthie's work on the anti-state state, it's the questions about how these moments in time and regimes of power are continually made and remade, that they're not static, fixed, natural, or certain, that they're bound up in contingency. And for me, in thinking about the moment following the Civil War, in which really modernity and modernization, industrialization was made quite literally on the backs of imprisoned men and women, that what that required was both physical regimes of violence against Black women's body and discourses of power that rendered them marginal, othered, and disposable. And that, carceral capitalism, the building of roads, the laying of railroad line, the making of brick, the making of houses, the digging for natural resources, what that required is extreme forms of terror against Black women who could be incarcerated for any offense, to naturalize the system, to naturalize the hierarchies and taxonomies of power. And so that's what I was trying to think about by bringing questions of gender and Black feminism to Jim Crow modernity. And I learned much about how to do that from both Assata and from Ruth Gilmore's work.
Mm-hmm. Ruthie, your book is addressing a different moment in a crisis of racial capitalism, and you ask and answer a very specific question. Why did California, since 1984, build 23 major new prisons, locate them mostly on the vacated agricultural lands of the Central Valley, and then fill them with over 160,000 people, 2/3 of whom are Black or Latinx? And you give very fine-grained answers about the convergences and the confluences between the capitalist and the heads of state. And from this very specific story, you tell us that prison is the foundation of the anti-state state, a state that I think we're still living in. So I'm hoping that you can say a few words about the anti-state state.
Sure. Thank you, Naomi. And like all of my co-honorees, I am humbled to be part of this event this evening. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And big shout out to Assata Shakur. I'm old enough, I remember all of that. The anti-state state is characterized at the moment by all of the things, for example, that have been happening in Washington, D.C. Since the pandemic started. For example, the anti-state state printed $1 trillion of money, most of which went to banks and large corporations, not to people in need. The anti-state state uses the machinery of the state to condemn the fact that a social welfare state could exist, and then uses that same machinery to enrich and empower and control and destroy, do all of those things at once. So that is the anti-state state. You read William Barr, read Donald Trump, read Barack Obama, that's the anti-state state. I set out to write that book because I'd been working with a group of mostly women, most of whom were mothers of adults and children who had been caught up in the California system. Most of them, but not all of them, were Black. And they couldn't understand what had been happening to them. So this really connects with a lot of what everybody else has been talking about. And as I look closer and closer at the, well, you used the phrase, Naomi, at the finely grained details of what had happened in California, I could see with stunning clarity how the pieces that mass incarceration is made of are also the raw material for us to make our freedom. So not only can it not be reformed, we need to take all that stuff and turn it into something else. That is the point of that book. And that is what I learned from thinking with somebody like Dionne Brand, whose story, I used to like the Dallas Cowboys, blew my mind a long time ago when we first met. And thinking as well that what abolition is not the absence of prison, is the presence. It's presence, which means that abolition, getting there, is life in rehearsal. And that's what I've learned from reading everybody's work who's gathered here tonight. Thank you.
Albert Woodfox and Nicole Fleetwood, I wanted to ask you about an additional layer of the prison industrial complex, one that compounds the layers of colonialism, settler colonialism, and the ongoing brutalities of racial capitalism. And that's a thick layer of misrepresentation of the monstrous lies that support and normalize the prison industrial complex. Nicole, you've written that prisons are a staple of popular culture. They draw on images that come deep from the archive of anti-Black racism. These are images meant to horrify and to titillate. And Albert Woodfox, you've written of the lies told under oath, hand over heart, by people who put you in solitary confinement. These are lies that also come from the archive of anti-Black racism, lies that were so desperately trying to contain and kill all of the liberatory potential of the Black Panther Party. Albert, I'm hoping that you can start us off by talking about prison's infrastructure of lies, and how do you see your own disciplined study, your own poetry writing, and your memoir as a way to counter the infrastructure of lies?
Thank you. I'd like to thank the National Book Foundation for giving me this opportunity and for allowing me to be amongst such distinguished authors. Solitary, for me, was about survival. It was about the strength of the human spirit and soul. And it was about bringing to the American people and people of the world the horrors of solitary confinement. And, to show that it had no penological purpose, that the sole purpose of it was to break the human spirit, to destroy the sense of self-worth, and to exploit in whatever way possible the disunity of the men and women held in solitary confinement. And so, myself and Harmon and Robert King, Herman Wallace, who we lost 4 days after winning his freedom, I just felt as though I had to use every ability that I had developed in 44 years and 10 months of solitary confinement to bring this horror to the forefront and to make the people realize what was being done in their name. I watched so many over the last, 44 years and 10 months of solitary and almost 5 years of freedom. I watched constant change and transformation going on in this country and in the world, and none of it for the purpose of humanity, none of it for building humanity and better societies, and changing the term prison from the very foundation up to now. I think it is sad that prisons now, and prisoners in particular, represent dollars and cents. You have, mass incarceration. You have private prison industrial complexes, making money, trading on Wall Street. And I think, so we have what's now is this modern day slavery, in which you went from being a slave of an individual plantation owner to a slave of the state. And with that comes the awareness that, under the 13th Amendment, that supposedly free slave, there's a clause in there in which legalizes slavery in this country. If you convict of a felony, you become a state as a slave. I'm a slave of the state. And of course, slaves have no rights, no human rights, no constitutional rights, no statutory law rights. And so I just wanted to, start a conversation along with Harmon, who sacrificed his life for this cause, and Robert King, to bring this to the American people, to give them another society, Department of Corrections, or DOCs as their acronym, have controlled the narrative of prisons for so long, and they have given an illusion to people in the country what prisons are, what purpose they serve, and the men and women and children that are held in these institutions. And so I thought it was very important that we thought it was very important to set an example that if a cause is noble, you could carry the weight of the world on your shoulder. And we thought fight for humanity and to become a part of humanity was a noble cause. And so, I just like to also say that, I think it was Piper spoke earlier about the tone of the book. That full credit goes to my fiancée, Leslie George, because, while the words and the story and the experiences are mine, she set the tone.
Wonderful. Nicole Fleetwood, your beautiful book, Marking Time, says that art making can be a practice of survival, as Albert Woodfox just spoke about. And you also describe ways that art making can be an aesthetic journal that documents one's time in captivity. And it can also be a mode of connecting to others. But I appreciate that you are very clear in saying that art in prison does not resolve the injustices of the carceral system. So there is no easy fix or too simple punchline for anyone to take from your book. I'm wondering if you can just elaborate a bit this idea of the actuality of art's liberating potential and its limits.
So thank you very much, Naomi. Thank you to the National Book Foundation. And it's such an honor and just delight to be in conversation with so many people I admire, and everyone on this committee. And every honoree is actually they're cited in my book. It's great to be in conversation with people whose work I respect so much. I just want to say that thank you for prefacing our conversation by bringing up the Black radical tradition and bowing to Assata. And I think, one of the things I was interested in doing in this book was centering the freedom dreams of people held in punitive captivity, to use Robin Kelly's, concept of freedom dreams, but also to think about the long history of aesthetic practice as part of the Black radical tradition, and how so much of that aesthetic experimentation takes place in captivity. I say in the book that the history of captivity is the history of people planning, dreaming, envisioning freedom, and art and aesthetic practice are at the center of that. And for me, I think in terms of just my approach to the book, I went into it not knowing what I was going to write. I went into it being a student. And for me, it was really centering the discernment, the practices, the theories of people who are held in punitive captivity, and really being in deep conversation with people who are doing the work from inside. So I was interested in how art and aesthetics, the kind of currency that is an anti-capital currency, one that's about relationality, one about kind of working against extractive resource hoarding, one that's about literally creating mutual aid societies and resource pooling and peer mentoring and creating other forms of pedagogy. I mean, there's all these incredible art collectives and forms of training that's happening inside prisons. And also using this idea of societal failure, of being labeled, of being literally stigmatized and wearing that stigmata on your body. So there is this representation of throughout, right? There's just various levels where I'm kind of engaging representation. And one is that most imprisoned people walk around with an ID card on their body that's labeling them a bad subject. And so much of the kind of aesthetic engagement that people are involved in is literally refuting that, what is pinned to the body. For me, there was all these ways in which I was interested in being in conversation with people who are working against, carceral spectatorship. And using that to create other forms of coming together, of collaborating, of envisioning a future.
We have time for maybe just one or two audience questions, and I wanted to prioritize the questions that have come in from readers at the DC jail who've been participating in the Free Minds Book Club. So this is a question for anyone who wants to jump in. The question is from David, who asks, is there one single moment you can look back on and say, this was my turning point? This was the exact moment I decided enough was enough.
Well, for me, I think the turning point after probably 20-something years of re-education and developing moral principles and values and to dedicate my life to live by, even though I was in prison, it was the realization that my mom was my first true hero. That the many books I had read and the feeling of I've seen this before, or I've heard this before, and come to the realization that, you know, these same values and this kind of courage and example came from my mom. And, you know, that my very first hero was my mother. And so that was a turning point for me. And the rest was just applying the thing that she had taught me to the things I believed in and being willing to make the sacrifice to try to educate other men who I lived around. So that was the turning point for me, you know.
Wonderful. I want to read the two more questions that we have, and perhaps just ask for a once round of closing comments for you to give some final words and reflecting on these final questions. So Selena and Marcus ask, how do we get from reading to revolution? How can we build the mass movements that we so desperately need? And Gregory asks, quote, how do we as African Americans change the narrative of our own stories?
Again, if no one's, you know, for me, I think as African American people, my pet peeve is I think that as a people, we forgive betrayal too quickly, and this always keeps us in a vulnerable position. And we have got to, you know, start taking betrayal and forgiveness much more serious, particularly, you know, in dealing with our own communities and what we do to one another. And, you know, a lot in this last cycle, a lot of people, a lot of African American men and women, I think, betrayed us as a part of the human race. And their records and their clothing and all that is still selling. And so they have, you know, I refer to them as bootlickers. They have betrayed us, and there is no, they're not paying a price for it. And so until we start taking this kind of betrayal serious and let members of African American ethnic group and anyone who betray us know that there will be hell to play in the future.
Kelly Lytle Hernández.
Sure. I love those questions. Thanks for ending with those. I guess I would just quickly say that many a great revolution has begun with a reading group, right? With a book club. And so what we're doing here today is part of that work that needs to be done. And so I'm glad that the folks in DC are reading together and talking together and thinking together and building together, right? So the power is in community. When we build together, when we grab back and transform how power is organized and give it to the people who have been so displaced and marginalized across time and space. Well, I shouldn't say give. When we take, it will not be given. We got to take it. So keep reading, keep talking to each other. I also want to just quickly speak to this question about when did you know, right? What was the aha moment? And I actually can't remember the beginning aha moment. I was blessed to be raised in the Black radical traditions, or at the knee of Black feminist scholars and readers who gave this to me like mother's milk, right? However, I'm reaffirmed every day in the work that we do. Miss Burton and I actually serve on a commission together, and we go into the local jails here and we report on conditions. And every time I enter into those spaces, it is reaffirmed for me the inhumanity that we are doing to one another on a daily basis, and the urgency that we, one, take care of people right now, and that, two, that we imagine our way out of this and do the work that needs to be done. So thank you very much for this gathering today. And I look forward to working with everybody as we move forward together.
Nicole Fleetwood, final thoughts.
Yeah, I really love what Kelly just said about the importance of studying together. And I think what I've learned from just working on the book, this is my aha moment and my final thoughts, is that expand your coalition, expand who you're collaborating with, expand who you think you can learn from, because it's we have to expand our imagination to actually create the world that we want to inhabit. And that means really moving beyond our comfort zones.
Wonderful. Dionne Brand.
I think to the question of reading to revolution, I think that all of my learning years in traditional school systems are not what led me to awakening about revolution, but reading outside of that, trying to find the Black radical tradition and finding it, thankfully, when I was 17, through works like Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, through Du Bois's writings, etc., that opened me up and opened the world up to the other possibilities that I could live, and that there was a life that had been lived, and there were struggles that had been done before my arrival that I needed to pay attention to, and that would free me in a sense, right? And so it's strange, but this moment of this pandemic has shown me the incredible genius of Black thinking in the world, right? The freshness and newness and possibility that it has gifted the world. A friend of mine talks about the gifts, Black gifts, that it took Black and Indigenous people to rethink the world, right? To rethink the world that we had been given. So I think in this moment too, we have to think perhaps about the seduction of capital, right? The seduction of consumerism and capital, which also repeats and regurgitates our very bodies to do that, right? That violence is reproduced in order to produce capital, and what our location in all of that is. So reading has allowed me to expand the possibilities for freedom. And so it's been a wonderful gift from my early years to the present, and it continues to be. And I continue to find the most sparkling thinking coming out of that Black radical tradition. Yeah.
And Ruth Wilson Gilmore.
Well, thank you all once again for an amazing evening together, and thank you to the National Book Foundation for including me in this. I have so many thoughts and so little time. So the first thing that I will say is to remind people Frederick Douglass's story about when he was a little guy and the white lady in the in the house was going to teach him to read. And the white man came home and said, if you teach him to read, he will be forever unfit to be a slave. Now, there's nothing magical about reading, and yet there's nothing not magical about reading. And so what we do as readers is to rehearse the magic that's in it. And that's a very active thing that is constantly unfolding, whether the books are old or new, whether the book seems to be other to our experience or seems to relate our experience directly. So reading to revolution is, as my comrades have said, is reading together and reading to rehearse the abolition geography that we have to make from the carceral geography that we live. And I want to say, too, that as we think about especially what my sister Dionne Brand just said about resisting capital, this is hugely important, and it's going on a world scale. It's not only in the United States, not only afflicting Black and brown people in the United States, even though half of the entire US labor force has some kind of disqualifying arrest or conviction record that keeps them from being able to work in the capitalist system, which tells you what's wrong with capitalism, not what's wrong with the people. There's an international movement that is constantly expanding between and among working people around the world in the global North and the South, led by women, led by queer and gender nonconforming people. It's happening everywhere at all different kinds of scales. And that is where I find that the moment that I realized aha is always being renewed. I said aha in 1969 when COINTELPRO murdered my cousin. I said aha again and again, and I'll always say it because we can't make a new world if we're not constantly saying aha. So aha, thank you.
Aha, indeed. Our time together has been too short. I want to thank all of these magnificent authors. I want to encourage everyone to practice reading and revolution with and through these 7 beautiful books. Our time together was too short, but the books are here, which means you can read and scheme with others in reading groups with these books. And in doing so, I hope that that will be a way that you can rehearse the magic yourselves. Thank you with such love and appreciation. Thank you to everyone for sharing your work, for sharing your brilliant ideas, for lifting up, for being a voice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Thank you.